My name is Emily Towns. I'm dean here at the Divinity School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you and to introduce my colleague, Bruce Morrill. Dr. Bruce Morrill holds the Edward A. Malloy Chair of Catholic Studies here at Vanderbilt Divinity School. He is a Roman Catholic priest and member of the Society of Jesus, the religious order commonly known as the Jesuits. He has lectured widely in North America, Europe, and Australia, and keeps involved in various forms of pastoral work. For example, here in Nashville, he presides and preaches regularly at the Cathedral of the Incarnation and provides pastoral liturgical ministry to men at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison. Before coming to Vanderbilt, he was on the faculty of Boston College for 15 years and has enjoyed appointments to visiting chairs and fellowships at a number of institutions in the U.S. and Ireland. And next year, he will be at Fordham. And if he doesn't come back, I may resort to violent social action and break both his legs. The title of his community breakfast talk is Evangelization and Justice, Fundamentals of Pope Francis's Mission. Pope Francis has firmly established his reforming and renewing mission for the Roman Catholic Church, its leadership, and its 1.2 billion members on the gospel as the announcement of the deliverance for the poor. This morning, Father Morrill will analyze the teaching and practices of Pope Francis, a fellow Jesuit, in light of the nearly 150 years of modern Catholic social teaching, which is grounded in Scripture and the tradition of the common good. It has a priority for participating in the workings of society as a fundamental human right and koinonia, that is, sharing or joint participation, as the integral link between liturgy and ethics. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Morrill as this morning's community breakfast speaker.
Good morning. It's a grateful, gratifying experience to see so many folks, alumni of the Divinity School, supporters, currently enrolled students across Vanderbilt, fellow employees, community members. This is a joyous occasion and a privilege for me. I am in my third year on this faculty and have a few times availed myself of these sessions, these occasions. As Emily explained, I myself am a Jesuit. We are a religious order in the Roman Catholic Church, which was founded in the 16th century, about 475 years ago, by Ignatius of Loyola, the sainted Ignatius, who also in 1922, along with Catherine of Siena and Teresa of Avila, was declared a doctor of the Church, which is to say that St. Ignatius's writings are church doctrine, as are Catherine's and Teresa's and others. And I mention all that because Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina, is himself a Jesuit. And part of what I'll be working on this morning for this talk, working through with you, is how I, from the start, have so readily been able to perceive his Jesuit formation and his Jesuit life in his work and in his ministry. I suspect that the truly gratifying number of folks who've come together this morning, this number is symbolic, a real symbol of people's real interest in this Pope, this Bishop of Rome. And I am going to speak for about a half an hour, perhaps as much as 40 minutes. We'll see. I want to watch the time so we have some Q&A. Along the following lines. First, with you, summary or a few photo shots, a few clicks of images of this Pope since he was elected a year ago next month. From that, I wish to turn to some questions then about, because increasingly I receive these questions about, excuse me, whether or not or how this Pope is people's anxious apprehension or hope changing church teaching or polity. Then, thirdly, to get into a commentary on the most extensive piece of writing he has done thus far, I will provide a little bit of information from and commentary on his Apostolic Exhortation, a lengthy document entitled The Joy of the Gospel, and try to wrap it up, or I will wrap it up from there. So first, to give us a little review or reprise of our images, probably common images of Pope Francis. My own happy little vignette. I get to tell stories now any way I want. You asked me to speak here. And this is kind of, well, this is to me quite delightful. I was driving from the north side of Atlanta, Cobb County, back to Nashville on the afternoon of March 7th. I had gone to Cobb County where the Jesuits have a retreat center in a small community where they are also now founding a Cristo Rey school, a high school explicitly for serving underprivileged students. It's a new mission for us in Atlanta, and the first phase is 2 years of fundraising just to get this school on a certain pattern we've developed around the country, this school for students who could not otherwise afford it, off the ground. But there's a sad side to it too. The reason I went in the middle of my work week and jammed it in, not without some grousing, that's a reflection on my character, was that now annually we Jesuits in the United States have to both study material and take an online exam and then physically be at a meeting in a Jesuit community where we sign documents that will be filed with our lawyers to attest that I am ongoingly trained for the protection of vulnerable people. So you see, there's this whole part of my life, I'm in my 32nd year as a Jesuit, which now is irrevocably touched or shaped by the disasters of child assault and other assault of other vulnerable people, and all the kinds of other cover-ups and everything else we've all been aware of. So I want to give you that poignant image. You know, for me, the excitement of us Jesuits doing what we truly believe we've discerned God's called us to do, give the spiritual exercises, Retreat House in Cobb County, have a faith that seeks justice with a fundamental option for the poor, start this Cristo Rey High School in Atlanta, and yet also the reason I had to squeeze this in about an 18-hour frame, this other sin, this disaster in our lives. So I'm driving back. I hope you see my point in all that, right? What characterizes this Pope's papacy from the start then, right, is a church characterized by both these realities, as it were. And not only these, but they're biggies, right? So I'm driving back, and I'm an NPR person, big surprise, old lefty, and but it's good quality stuff. So I forget what show is on, and I remember I was just getting by, you know, the tight loops of Chattanooga, in breaks the news that white smoke has come from the Sistine Chapel. It's like, yay, drama. And Sylvia Poggioli starts doing her reporting. Though her accent is less pronounced over the years. I'm old enough now to notice this over the years. So they talk about this Argentinian's been elected, this Argentinian Archbishop Cardinal, and quickly as she's giving her review, she says, and he's a Jesuit. And I literally, in my car, spoke out loud. I said, oh, well, now, you know, that's ridiculous. And the reason I said that was from the time I entered the society, it was very clear part of our common knowledge, wisdom, was that there would never be a Jesuit pope. And the reason is we were once a very powerful order within the Roman Catholic Church. And even therefore in the societies, in some of the parts of the world where we serve. So I was just kind of like, oh my gosh, poor things, they're just trying to do this fast, and misinform. But within a half hour, no, this is really confirmed and so forth. Vignette number 1 then. I'm driving along and they describe the man coming out and they have a translator. And they explain, they translate what he says, right? And his opening words are simply hi. And he gives them some very gentle words, right? As the Bishop of Rome. And I said, oh my goodness. I mean, because John Paul II's 12th encyclical back in the 90s was unum sint, that they may be one, quoting John's gospel, was emphasizing that we must recover, I don't know if they have the will to do it, but we, I guess, the hierarchy, must recover the papacy from its roots in the first millennium. In other words, before the schisms, first East and West, and etc. For him to identify himself as the Bishop of Rome so emphatically was already this great consolation to me. But remember, he asked everybody to pray for him. Right at the end of it, he said, well, this is all I can do for you, people of Rome, tonight. I wish you a good night, and I'll see you soon. It was very sweet. And then he asked them all to pray for him. And what stunned me was how the NPR, at least, just let the air go silent. One would expect that you'd hear, and now the crowd in Rome is all... this is what they do, right? And it makes sense. You don't want, as people, but I was stunned. And so I found myself praying, and then... we go from there. The photographs later caused me quite a bit of laughter because you see he bows down, right? And you see all these shots of the plaza, people praying fervently, but all the cardinals standing on the balconies around him are going like this. Again, a snapshot. The people knew how to pray. They weren't looking around at each other at all. And that was a real mission, that was a real statement of what it is to be what he keeps both trying to do in practice and then has instructed in his first document, Apostolic Exhortation. The whole purpose of the church is in service to the world. And service. And so the other snapshots we know that caught people's attention instantly. The next day he pulled a very smart media ploy and went back to the guest house where he'd stayed and paid his bill. And he said to the press, yeah, I know this is gimmicky, but I'm trying to show priests how they should behave. That's a quote, an English translation quote. So you see, rather than pontificating, pun I guess intended, I don't know, about stuff, the man is showing that in the very spirit of Francis of Assisi, very humble, the Jesuit takes a Franciscan as his patron name, Francis of Assisi had said, famously, to his own friars, never tire of proclaiming the gospel. You even use words if you have to. Stunning. And that's it. Because the gospel isn't about ideas and arguments, is it? It's about relationships, fundamentally, which will then include dialogue, teaching, learning. So we have other images, him carrying his own satchel onto planes, his being driven around in an old car, blah, blah, blah. All of it matters. Touching to people was his saying the only service on Holy Thursday for him would be at a prison. So going to the prison isn't a do-gooder add-on. It was, that's the one liturgy that the Holy Father's doing today, is in a prison, where he washed the feet of young men and women, Christian and Muslim. You may know from the background of that, when I was in Atlanta 20 years ago doing my doctorate, huge dust-ups in that archdiocese as only one example, over whether or not at the Holy Thursday service priests should be allowed to wash women's feet. What are one's priorities? So people see all this and it captures their attention. The final one of perhaps most famously and perhaps expanded on in ways that may not be quite justified, when he's flying back from Brazil and he gives a free-flowing press conference on the plane, and they ask him about homosexual men in the priesthood. Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, one of the first orders of business he went about in the fall of 2005 was to sign off on a document that John Paul had kept shoving around the surface of his desk. And that was to absolutely prohibit any man with homosexual tendencies, his terms, from seminary or the priesthood. And then for those in the priesthood already who find themselves in such an afflicted condition, to commit themselves to their vow of celibate chastity. There's a presumption in even making the request. This man shrugs and says, if a man is of goodwill, seeking to live by the gospel, and wishes to do it, but happens to be homosexual, he shrugs and says, well, who am I to judge? So you see these great differences, and it's not about documents, it's this brilliant way of his wanting to be with people and realizing that we're in a very different age, finally, and how it is to communicate what kind of a church he wants us not to become, because so much of the Roman Catholic Church already is this, but finally to affirm it and to empower it. Content, then. People are anxious for doctrinal change, and there's been none of that, and he's only been Pope for a year. Quite frankly, myself as a prognosticator, pride is a vice. I hope this isn't proud, but I'm booked at 11 on the phone with the New York Times. I'm becoming a bit of a commentator, among others. They're always looking for what they think would be the concrete way, and that is to impose teaching and tell everyone they must conform, which is the polar opposite of the way he's proceeding, right? So I have to keep telling these reporters, I've got nothing to, I can't give you what you want, because he isn't. He's working with something far more fundamental, and that is how people are the church together, and the church in service to a wider world, each other in the wider world. So this is not what can be found, nor what I can report, but what I can is two things. Further, he has made it emphatically clear through both his actions and his preaching, his delightfully homely preaching at daily Mass in the Workers' Chapel at the Vatican, that the church is the church when it is the church of, O-F, the poor. Not a church for the poor, you see, but a church of the poor. And the other point would be, from the start, his emphatic instruction to his fellow clerics and so forth, that the church must be a church that goes out. This is a constant theme or point in his preaching, teaching, and discourses. This must be a church that goes out. He said, it's not good enough, and we've seen this, I lived up north for those 15 years, where you'd see all those canvas banners go up at Lent, our doors are open, Catholics can come home, come on in, because there's been a virtual collapse in the Northeast of participation. And he's saying, that's a mistake. You go out and meet them where they are. You don't put up your canvas signs and say, well, you can come back, come on in. No, go out, he says. You have to go out. And in fact, if I may be biographical, people wondered, especially some of my own colleagues up in Boston, like why I wanted to accept this endowed chair here and come here. It was because even the previous pope had been exhorting us Jesuits to not lose our fundamental charism, and that is to go out to the edges, or to translate the Latin and the other Latina languages, to go out to the frontiers. And people yuck here in the United States, we're the frontier, yeah. But the point is frontier, boundary, edge. Go out there. And so these are key themes: a church of the poor, and a church that goes out from itself, ourselves. He exudes then, the third point, the title that he gave to his first apostolic exhortation is the joy of the gospel. I think we would all agree, and perhaps one of the ways in which people are so taken with this man is the sheer joy that he exudes, the authenticity of it. It's an apostolic exhortation, which came out a few months ago in the fall. And I'll tell you briefly what an apostolic exhortation is, because this, here's the point. The Second Vatican Council 50 years ago had one of its own key reforming elements in its dogmatic constitution on the church. Put up with all the verbiage, I'll get to the point. In its dogmatic constitution on the church, a purposeful restoration of the episcopacy, of the office of bishop, as not the branch manager from the Vatican, but as the genuine pastor of a diocese, with his own, it's not autonomy. See, that's our modern thing. Either you're controlled or you're autonomous. That's not the polarity, you see. But rather, as the bishop, the shepherd, the pastor of that diocese, who's serving it on its own conditions, on its own turf, but of course in union and collegium, this is the language of the document, with the Bishop of Rome. But in turn, the Bishop of Rome, always speaking, writing, and acting, which has always been on the books, but just in collegium with the bishops. So my point is, from that, renewed then was a pattern of regular synods or conferences or conventions of bishops, and that they would come from regional parts of the world, you see. Otherwise, you end up in abstractions. And after these synods, whenever they happen, there's some going on every year or so, every couple of years, from different parts of the world. An apostolic exhortation is issued from the Holy Father. It's just what it is, an exhortation to be what? What's an apostolos in Greek? An apostolos is a missionary. How did the word apostolos land on the ears of first century Mediterranean people? When they heard the word apostolos, it wasn't some fancy, unique word apostolos, missionary, emissary, that's the word that would come to mind. Footnote, episkopos, administrator. An apostolic exhortation, then, is an exhortation coming from that synod of bishops who met on a certain topic, issued to at least their region, but also for the benefit of the whole church. What the Pope did in this case was he did something more expansive. He used it as an occasion to issue a very broad-ranging, long document, touching on many, many topics, but that have a certain unifying thread. So it's the joy of the gospel is not an encyclical. Encyclicals have a level of authority where the teaching is about matters of faith and morals, you see. And it's trying to keep defined doctrine, trustworthy or true teaching. An apostolic exhortation is trying to do just that. It's trying to work with the teaching that exists, but to make it effective. Okay? So this apostolic exhortation, a few things. The first part of it, not surprisingly, given if my talk has been organized and clear enough, the first section, not surprisingly then, is his exhortation for a church that goes out from ourselves, or out from herself. He uses the language of church's mother eventually, but a church that goes out. Okay? So it's a church that is apostolic, a church that is missionary, you see. And he beautifully describes how, in the next section, how that's not a choice, that's the Lord's command for us in the power of the Spirit that raised him from the dead and founded us as a church and animates us as a church. That's who we should be. So a church that goes out, a church that, as he says, that knows that if you do that, if we all do that, when you go out, your first concern isn't what? To preserve everything and keep it all neat and clean. You're going out. He said, I much would prefer a church that goes out and makes mistakes and gets bruised and dirtied than one that stays in its palaces and waits for people to come to it. Apparently this was a theme in his decades and a half of leadership as in Archbishop of Buenos Aires and before that as a bishop. So a church that goes out, he says, is going to make mistakes. Don't worry about it. Welcome to the human condition. Welcome to, if we really mean what we mean about incarnation. But far more importantly, I would say as a theologian, about the Spirit of the crucified and risen one animating us. That's who we are. So he goes at length about this. And then in the next section, he does a series of, to set the condition of our global situation, in which, address how we will address our global situation. He does it, the structure, the frame is through a series of no's and yeses. So no to X, no to Y. Rejections of these different things. Does that make the point? N0. N-O, not K-N-O. So no to different things. No to capitalist greed. No to clericalism, which continues to afflict the church. He doesn't pull any punches, and many other no's. And then yes to, and he has a series of yeses. What I wanted to do with that briefly then, to show you something of the Jesuit character of his work. For me, I instantly, in reading the document, realized, oh my gosh, it's the two standards. In the second of the 4 weeks or major moves of St. Ignatius's exercises, a 30-day silent retreat in its fullest form, one finds oneself falling in love with Jesus because he's told you he loves you and wants you to go on mission with him. And at one point, one does a meditation in which one feels drawn to make a decision. Standards mean banners, right? We still use them today. You know, you go to graduation here, all of a sudden we try to get all medieval on it, and the younger people would get it, I hope. Well, actually, middle-aged people. Anyway, and carry the standards, carry the banners. Okay, right. Symbolism, again, is the most important stuff people do. Right? There you go. For Ignatius, it's which standard are you going to march behind? And it's the standard of Satan or the standard of Christ Jesus. But he has one meditate not on that as an abstract idea. I've decided, imagine, I've decided to follow Jesus. Isn't he lucky? But rather, one contemplates again. What one does is one contemplates what does the world look like and what does life look like if one is following the standard of the evil one or the standard of the anointed one. Satan or the Christ. You see? And that's what changes the person. That's what takes root in the person. And that's what, because one's always in touch with the pain and the brokenness of the world in that. That is what should keep us cured or healed or constantly delivered from any arrogance, any condemnation, simple condemnation. Not that there shouldn't be instruction and correction. That's not the point. But I hope you're getting the tone, right? That's characterizing this papacy. And then so to describe this as no's to these things and yes to these things, and under each of them fulsome paragraphs that fill out both what is light and darkness in these. To me, as a Jesuit, Ignatius spirituality, well, that's what that is. And all I can be is grateful to God for that. And so, these no's, it's a rangy document, and the no's, and it catches a lot of attention in the press. The no, when it came out, the no's especially are to laissez-faire capitalism, and he even very explicitly gives a paragraph on trickle-down economics. For those of us that are old, and I own that. I'm not doing that. It's like, let's own it, and let's exercise the wisdom we're supposed to. Because younger people were born after the emergence of the terminology of trickle-down economics in the 80s, right? But this was a whole approach which, especially after the collapse of Soviet communism, eventually has taken hold stunningly, heartbreakingly, scandalously over these 30 years, right? David Stockton, the very man who engineered the rhetoric and the policies for the Reagan era, later denounced it all. But that's what's taken hold. And so the Pope is describing in unmitigated clarity how all over the globe now you have very, very tiny percentage. You're talking probably easily less than 2% of the population controlling the massive majority of the material wealth and power in this world. And he's simply saying, this is scandalous. What kind of a world, what kind of a standard, what kind of a banner are we following? People try to explain it away quite quickly, right? If you pick up on that stuff, it's my job to. I'm interested too. I'm not cynical about this. And so you had on the one hand, and this speaks to the disasters we're suffering in our country now, in its polarized condition. The blowhard Rush Limbaugh immediately went on the air that afternoon, once he'd read this stuff, or his people had read it for him and got their thing all ginned up. And he called the Pope a Marxist communist. So you see, that kind of name-calling again, which banner, right? Is one going to persuade by one's behavior and patiently, if God grants him, Benedict XVI started at the same age roughly and got a good 8 or 9 years, and patiently go about doing something? Or shall we resort every day to name-calling and riling people up? But that's a question for me. And I would propose it's a question for you and for us. It really is. Because we live in a time, whether we like it or not, that is extremely polarized. Why? Because we're going through a completely seismic anthropological shift. How humans go about being human. If that intrigues you, but I'll prescind from starting the lecture. That's what I do. It's no time. But when that happens, people panic, right? Or they run ahead of themselves, etc. So the Pope was interpreted that way, you see. Or in the States, very predictable institutes and certain organs of journalism said, oh, well, clearly he was only talking about Argentina, where there's been so much corruption and horror in Latin America. He couldn't really know what he's talking about, because here in the United States, ... Nice try, but it's not just a try. That's very effective. What's being found, if Emily was still here, she's an ethicist, and I know some of her own work has been showing this, people largely aren't persuaded by ideas, right? Just deal with people that want to keep pushing this creationism, right? Against all the research of science. It's not about evidence. It's about what tribe or pack or clique you're running in. So all the more, I think, this is a brilliant man, not in book knowledge, not in dressing up in ermine, not in trotting out stuff that'll make the church feel like it's the church again, that church, but rather a man who knows against all of that, all of us who wish might join him in trying to live that kind of patient life by example. It's not about flashy changes of doctrine, is my point, if people were wondering what the point is today. So he goes to these no's and yeses, but part of the no's, like I say, I'm telegraphing it, but paragraphs and paragraphs on how priests, bishops, religious is our term for religious priests, order priests like me, brothers, religious sisters, nuns, and so forth, all must recover what it would mean to truly live a profession of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but especially poverty, and then obedience is obedience to the gospel and the church, etc. He pulls no punches. He also does a long section on preaching. See how rangy it is? He was just talking about capitalism and so forth. It's a very rangy document. But that's truly a crisis in the Roman Catholic Church. Polling data throughout the Northern Hemisphere, at least, has found consistently since the 70s people's deep discouragement and ongoing pain in having to listen to the homilies to which they're subjected. This is an objective fact. This is from polling data done especially in the earlier decades, 70s and 80s, up in out of Chicago, the Sociology Department of the University of Chicago, now the Pew Research Institute and the Center for Applied Apostolate at Georgetown, etc. You see, of people actually as they're coming out of church, regular church-going Catholics. So it's a problem. And of course it has deep roots because preaching had nothing to do with the sacraments up until 1965, for at least a millennium in the West, or in what becomes the Roman Catholic Church in the Counter-Reformation 500 years ago, etc. So this is important, and it makes sense, right? Because his preaching is, again, what people they've been hanging on it, right? I mean, the press is there every day in this very, very simple modern chapel where he does this Mass. Yeah, it's effective. The man knows what he's talking about. Just look at the evidence. So it goes through all that, but finally he moves on to questions about how it is one evangelizes. What's the yes? And the yes is to the things I've already been saying today, by persuasion, by example, etc. And finally, then a major section of it then is the church of the poor, you see. And he uses the language from the Second Vatican Council's pastoral constitution on the church. A very sizable document, And what language does he use? Is that the church, if it truly is going to proclaim, and again, not so much just by its words, but by its practices, the universal salvific will of God, that God desires that all God has created be saved or redeemed or delivered whole. Okay, got that? The universal salvific will of God. That only is a proclamation. Remember the title of the gospel, Evangelium, announcement. It's only a proclamation that has any truth to it, any power to it, if the flip side of it is, or the elaboration on it is, and therefore, if God is revealing continuously the mystery that God's is a universal salvific desire for all creation, humanity, then God has a fundamental or a special option is a strange way to translate the Latinate word, but option, which is to say love or affective commitment to the poor. So any deistic notions or any other ways we want to fill in what we think God is, there's the disaster again, right? What would it be in this case? Well, if God is God, then God should treat everybody equally and fairly. And then when that argument starts up, whether from a 15-year-old or a 65-year-old, it's nothing but childishness, right? It's like kids standing there, well, how come he gets that and I didn't get one? Happens all the time. I've been a pastoral minister for 22 years now. Well, 32 years, actually, ordained 22. It's not the God we're talking about, is it? So the whole call is always go back and meet the God of the gospel, or ask that God to come to us. Don't fill in the blanks or project on God who we think God should be. Because the God of the gospel is scandalous. And prefers to go out to every and anyone in any situation that the common knowledge on the ground in a given place, the sinfulness of humanity says, writes off as godless. That's exactly where God is. Not condoning the sin, the traps, the problems. Sin is a broadly conceived word in this case, but not watered down. No. It's saying, how do we know God? We know God by what God does. Right? Our whole Jewish heritage as Christians, if we accept the privilege, is to recognize that idolatry is the great trap that takes us away from God. And idolatry is fixing any image of who God is and then projecting it as if that's what's been revealed to us. No. The only way we know anything about God is by recounting the narratives of what God has done. That's why we got Scripture. So you look to, this fundamental option for the poor is to look to the Gospels and the other remaining books that comprise the 27 texts of the New Testament. And it exudes this. Why, finally? It's not do-gooderism. It's very Ignatian again for us, but it's true to the Gospel. What is your greatest desire? If you want to know and live the love of God, then one is going to go and follow apostolically in the pattern of that God revealed in Scripture. Not the God of polemics, not the God of defensiveness, not the God worried about recovering some triumphalistic church that collapsed. If I speak of Catholicism, and I do, modern Catholicism. No. That's what he's getting at. So I exhort you to read the exhortation, because then it goes to great detail and exudes that kind of life that he is exuding in his ministry, to my observation. It's, would you like to know God? Would you like to let God love you? Would you like to share the love of God? Would you love to follow that ultimate revelation of God in the Torah given to us by Jesus, us Gentiles? To love, what is it? What's it all about? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and whatever, and your neighbor as yourself. There you have it. And for that not to be a shibboleth, that's the trick. And for it to be scandalous, that's the gift. For it to empower us to make mistakes and to forgive each other in love, to teach and correct, but also most first of all to listen. Those that I say are the characteristics we see 1 year and running. So, I can talk. We do have some time for some Q&A. I understood from the fine folks organizing things, feel free to leave any time now if you need to go to work and different stuff. We can take some questions, but we won't keep people too much beyond the 8:30. And if you could speak from the gut. Get my first and then second, the lady in the beautiful blue shawl.
I wonder if you could elaborate more about clericalism that Pope has mentioned.
Sure.
Because it seems that over the last 50 years, the Church, since Vatican II, kind of evolved from struggle within those who think the church should be led by clerics and those, I guess, say, led by the people.
Right. Yeah, and that's a lot of ways the thing is polarized, and that's really part of the problem. The council and the reform, it's very much a case that the church will be led by a college of bishops and then presbyters, pastors, priests who work in collegium with them, all of them in union with the Bishop of Rome. So to polarize it, that's a great snapshot again. That's a mistake, you see. That's the problem. But the strain has been there because 50 years out, this Pope is still having to exhort in the document against the ongoing ways in which clericalism have not abated and in fact resurged. Okay? So the issue is to have that leadership body, that you have this whole leadership structure is simply is a human fact. If you're going to, and especially if you're talking about 1.2 billion people, right? And the whole thing. But then the question becomes how this, what this and how. That's the key. What about the people's role, etc.? Well, the question really becomes how to invite and really listen to people, you see, such that one then can be leading in a way that isn't just shibboleths of servant leadership. I mean, I gag when I say it, quite frankly. That's a personal statement. But that emerged to my ears. I heard that cropping up maybe a dozen years ago. The danger in it is a shibboleth. It's just a slogan. What? Because it's still trying to deny the fact, if used this way, I'm not saying everyone has this intent, but if it's used in a way that then again helps people to feel justified and not constantly called to an examination of conscience, individually and corporately, then we're in big trouble. Oh, we know we're servant leaders because we did our Appalachia in Detroit this year, the institution where I taught for 15 years. What makes us a Catholic university is so many of our students do volunteer work. Wait a minute, I just did my doctorate at Emory, where the largest student group, over 25% of the population, is volunteer Emory. What are you talking about? So there's a lot of these canards, and rather the much harder work 50 years out. What the heck's 50 years when you look at church history and reforms, right? We're struggling with that. I'm of a generation of Jesuits that really resists wearing Roman clerical garb. And I realize the generation now, too, behind me are the polar opposite. It's their job to, rebel against us. I get that. It's fine. No, really. And they're looking for identity in a world where there's not much. I get that. But for us, it's much more a matter of... For me, it was cinched in 2002 living in Boston, when story after story and news clip after news clip was people being quoted saying, we were raised to respect that caller, and that justified not saying anything about the child's assault, the assaults. For me, that cinched it. I'm listening. And I'm not going to stand there and harp at you about, yeah, but that isn't what it really means. No, that's the disastrous pattern. Did you have a question?
Yes.
Is there a mic? You ask questions and I preach. I do pontificate.
Good morning. So for undergrad, I attended DePaul University, and the paraphrase version of the Vincentian mission was, while you're in the community, you're going to be of the community. So my question to you is, do you have any suggestions for us as the beloved community of Vanderbilt to do, what do you think that we as the beloved community of Vanderbilt can do to further the work of the Catholic Church, regardless of denomination?
Oh, okay. And that's a really beautifully insightful question or desire, because it's recognizing it's to be in this pluralistic Christian, if you will, interdenominational Christianity, but then an interreligious world. I mean, we're a microcosm, aren't we? So how to go about being the beloved community, this beautiful imagery from the Gospel of John and the first letter of John. Well, I think the first thing, again, is to be people who listen and listen to God, so people who pray. But realize that prayer is something which, from its origins in Christianity, is a shared activity that can draw on, the Pope said, let's not be afraid of making mistakes. The way these things have developed as different prayer traditions have been through trials and errors and reforms. But find a way to pray together as Christians, which is different than praying together, though not. You see what I'm saying, as Christians? Because I hear your question is first about Christians. Well, we all profess belief in this same God. And most Christians profess the Nicene Creed. So I'm saying, if that's the framework. So we've got to pray. My own suggestion is then don't try to come up with ersatz services that nobody can identify with. Full disclosure, my specialty is sacramental liturgical theology. Will resist lecturing, let alone pontificating. But it's to say this: traditions are those things that people, that those social patterns of behavior and sharing that are so homely to people that they say, well, thus has it always been. Or when we do this or that, I can just move into it. My own, you asked, so this is my opinion, is that we be good friends to one another and take turns leading each other in prayer according to our traditions. And we don't go there to say, you do this wrong or I don't like that. Now that's going to include having to deal with the fact that everyone can't share the Eucharist by the position of the Roman Church, the other 11 Catholic churches, all the Orthodox churches, etc. But why go to where the problems and divisions are, right? Okay, so I'm saying pray together, but be good guests of one another, and then be good hosts of one another. And then you'll know something of what it is your passion is. Not just, what are your ideas and you're wrong about this. Hopeless. Devil's standard. There's mysticism then, there's prayer, and then there's action. Service. And the two should inform each other. We shouldn't try to make it one size fits all again. But how are we serving Vanderbilt? And through Vanderbilt, the wider concentric circles of our lives and world, you see. And how does, so it's not navel-gazing and it's not tribalism behind our church walls. It's where have we found the Lord calling us to do and what to do, you see, in generosity. And part of that's going to have to be outreach to people of other religions. Because that's who we are. So I'd say it's in the language of all these contemporary reforming theologies, but I'm saying it's a combination, I should do footnotes, of prayer and action, of liturgy and ethics. But you do it together. And you let each other take the leads at times. And you do it with an extremely generous spirit. You don't do it from, we are the one true whatever. That's what this Pope is not demonstrating. Okay, does that help enough? Because then I should take other questions, because I always, yeah. You know, it's a horrible thing. The speaker talks too long and then not that many questions. But again, you know, people need to go to work, go to whatever, run away at this point. That's...
In 20, or just about last week sometime, Pope announced 2015 to be the year of consecrated life.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to ask you to make yet another prediction of Pope Francis, and what do you see coming from him during this year of consecrated life?
I see nothing. I'll tell you what I don't see, right? If we follow the pattern, we're not going to see any new there isn't going to be any new directives again. There aren't going to be any, you know, all right, you take charge and you order everybody what to do. So that's what's not, I just cannot possibly imagine that. But what a year of evidence has shown me is that he is then going to try to demonstrate authentically through his own behavior, and he already has been for a year. I hope you've been picking up. I mean, I'm deeply inspired by this guy. You know, yeah, a year for consecrated life. This is the language for people who profess heritage. This is work that reaches back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. Vows of chastity, poverty, obedience, etc. Huh? So, it's a hard life to live at this point, but that's okay. because of the disasters that the congregations and orders have visited upon themselves. Okay? So I'd like to hope it's not about any kind of defensiveness again. You know, that it's not post-revolutionary France. But rather, I think it's going to have to be an exhortation so that we who live this life will feel renewed and strengthened to do it together and to follow what I was trying to say today so we can do that and invite others to it. There's been no, just in case people are wondering, because this is the vapid, quick results, snapshot world we live in. Okay, it just is. I'm just saying. You know, there have been no bumps or rises, for example, in membership in the United States in the Jesuits or other groups. This isn't going to be instant, and I don't think we'll ever grow very large again. The life we live, most young men and women, when I meet them, and it's only men can join, but is to say, but there are women's groups as well, but is to say, the biggest problem our people have found over these 30 years is that idea of obedience. And not in the way we certainly do it. It's not about, you tell me what to do and I've been lobotomized and now I'll do whatever you tell me. And that's a bit offensive way to put it. So genuinely, I apologize. But that kind of, you know, stuff. But rather, the obedience problem is people can't imagine giving their life for the rest of their lives where they're not the one calling the autonomous shots. And so what I would hope for is the naming of that. And then we need to demonstrate why I can't imagine a better life for myself. So, yeah. We got a few more minutes. Yes. I think here, yes. Or
what do you see ahead for the role of women in the Roman Catholic Church?
oh, good. Okay, yeah. Thank you. I didn't. That was a failure on my part in my outline. So thank you very, very, very much. He's made very clear his desire that women not be alienated, and yet here's the point where doctrine, in fact, he is teaching very explicitly. Is it not interesting that on the question of women, then he becomes very specific? And so even in this exhortation, he is stating that women need to have much more input, not just in the service mission of the church, but in the direction of the church. And yet he quickly adds, but of course the question of whether or not women can be ordained into offices, diaconate, I don't know about diaconate, but priesthood, and then he's still treating priesthood as if that's the foundation of how you become a bishop, which isn't the theology, but no. See? He's saying no, that question's closed. And he's justifying it in the exhortation and elsewhere so far on an ecclesiology, a theology of the church that shifts into language of the church. It's one image from the New Testament as the bride of Christ. And then the role of the leadership office or the ordained offices of the church as somehow exercising, I have to go look at the language both in the Latin and in the English translations. Therefore, the person presiding at the Eucharist, which for Roman Catholics and for him, very clearly, that's the whole thing, what it pivots on, is the Eucharist and the priesthood. To my mind, again, it's a very medieval, post-Tridentine or counter-Reformation imagery, but there you go. Fine. I mean, let's be honest. That's what we got. But it all pinges on that, so that it must be a male presiding at this because it's Christ doing this with Christ's bride. So I'm just reporting to you what I read in the documents, okay? And he says, but therefore there are lots of other ways of having power. My own hesitancy on that is, or my own dream is, will he sit down and listen a lot more to women and men? That's my own preference. To realize that that still, with any social body and institution, there's power and there's power. We have to parse out power, right? And so to say there are other ways, there are female ways to be powerful that aren't these male ways. But yeah, still, that is the most central power we're talking about And it seems that one can't just keep lecturing on why that shouldn't matter or why that's closed. But he is saying it's closed. I want to make sure, I don't want to misrepresent him in any way. Okay? And that's certainly my responsibility. I've taken the privilege to give my own comments on it. But I think that's going to be a real strain. Yeah, it's going to be a real struggle, especially, yes, yeah. Why don't we take one more? Is that it? Yeah. And then we'll finish up. I actually have to meeting at 9.
Thank you. There's going to be a synod on the family, and bishops in other parts of the world have asked for input from the people.
Yeah.
And I know that has not happened to my knowledge in the U.S. Do you think there are going to be any other ways that people living family life will have input to this synod?
Right. Well, the input that he called for, he told bishops throughout the world to get right what people have to say about questions, and in fact construct your own questions, etc. There are reports now coming from certain dioceses in Europe, for example, where this was done very openly across the population. Germany is the exact case so far. But other parts of the country too, of the world too. Here in the United States, this is an example actually of how, what we mean by each bishop is not just getting branch manager orders, you see. So the Pope has asked them to do it, but he's not telling them how to do it. So in the case of Germany, the bishops' conference, they all agreed, even though they would have the power to do it each their own way, they agreed they would do it through a wide survey. In the Diocese of Nashville, for example, the bishop sent out an explanation to his priests, and I'm on that list even though I'm not a priest of the diocese. I have faculties, or I can serve pastorally in the diocese. And he explained he wanted feedback from 3 specific groups. So he wasn't asking for a general word from the people. He was asking from, first of all, his priests and deacons. Secondly, he wanted to hear from people who have gone through the diocesan programs for marriage preparation. And thirdly, he wants to hear from young people who have been active in diocesan-sponsored youth programs. So that is how the Bishop of Nashville is getting his feedback. How other bishops in the United States are doing it, I don't know. This is where I work, and this is the letter I received. So there's a range of ways these bishops are doing it. Yeah. And all I can do is report that. Yeah.
It is on the internet, though, and you can send it in.
It is on the internet, and you can send it in. Right. That's not to the Diocese of Nashville.
Right. You send it right to the Pope's office.
Ah, I didn't even know that. So you might connect about how one does that online. So, and that's the world we're living in now, okay? So, but anyway, so there are processes, and we'll see how this input goes. Yeah. Does that answer the question adequately? Yeah, okay. Well, listen, privileged to do this. Thank you on a busy work day. And, yeah, just been a privilege.